Hi there everyone, welcome back to my series of short scripting tutorials for Arma Reforger. This tutorial will build upon my previous video on spawning AI. It should be straightforward enough to follow from this video, but if you find yourself struggling, I would recommend giving the previous video a watch. In this tutorial, we will be taking a look at using triggers to spawn AI via script. Using triggers to manage the spawning of your AI has several benefits, but most importantly allows you to manage your AI in a performant manner. In other words, you can better the overall performance of your missions by only spawning AI when they are needed. In a previous tutorial, in the previous tutorial, we used the game mode to store our methods for the AI spawning mechanism. Given that we would now like to use this mechanism in a trigger, we will need to move our methods out of the game mode class and into a separate class such that it can be invoked from more than one place. So the first thing we're going to do is go to our workbench and open up our previous project. If you named your project differently in the last video, you will need to find yours, but as we named it in the last video, it's rs_scripting tutorial. Once the project is open, we're going to go to our resource browser, and we're going to create ourselves a new folder called scripts. In this folder called scripts, we're going to create a new folder called game. And in this folder called game, we're going to create a new folder called AI. The folder structure here is important. Not necessarily this last layer, but for the scripts and game folders, we do need them to be there. And the reason we need them to be there is if they aren't there, or if your script is not nested inside of this folder structure, Arma Reforger will not be able to find the script file. So the last thing we need to do is inside of our AI folder, we're going to create a new script file, and we're going to call this thing scr_rs_ai spawner. Okay. And there you can see it reloads the game script, so it knows now that there is a game script that needs to be loaded. Right, so inside of our script file, we're going to open it up real quick. That should open up our script editor. So what we're going to do, first things first, is create ourselves a new class. It doesn't need to inherit anything, so it's just going to be a straight class called scr_rs_ai spawner. We're naming it the same as our file. Obviously, the class names inside of your files can be different from the file names themselves. Okay, and then some pretty basic things we're going to add to this class quickly. It's just a default constructor. We may utilize this this constructor mechanism in a later video, but for now, pretty much as the comment describes, we're just going to leave it as a default constructor. Similarly, we'll create a default destructor. So a default constructor and a default destructor. For those who are not familiar with object-oriented programming, these are methods that are used by the compiler. Is compiler the right word? Yeah, compiler is probably the right word. When you instance a new class and you don't supply it with any parameters, it invokes the default constructor, and then when the class is pulled out of scope, it invokes the default destructor. So if you are managing any variables here and you're trying to avoid a memory leak, I'm actually not sure what Arma Reforger's scripting process is like, whether or not it manages its own variables and destroys things when they fall out of scope. I believe it does. But if you wanted to ensure that something you're instancing is removed in a safe manner, or perhaps you want to save the contents of whatever you're instancing when the class is destroyed, then you will affect any changes you need to inside of the destruct. Right. So the next thing we'll need to do is open up our world. So to do that, we'll go back to the default workbench, go to the world we created. Once we've added the world we created, we can double click on that just to open it back up again. Right, so if you recall correctly from the last tutorial, we've stored everything inside of this game mode plain script file. So if we edit that, it'll open it up in our script resource. So what we're actually going to do first, before we open that up, is we're just going to rename this game mode. And the reason we're going to do that is just so that we can reference this game mode later. And the reason we'll want to reference it later is to invoke the AI spawns, and I'll explain how we do that when we get to it, but for now, we're just going to go ahead and rename this. I'm going to call it game mode underscore rs underscore test. So if we just make this change, and then we save this change, if we open up our script file again, we'll see that the class name for this game mode has been renamed to game mode underscore rs underscore test underscore class. This is going to be important later. Right, so the next thing we're going to do is copy all of our custom methods from inside this game mode here over to our script file. So if we just grab all of this stuff, and we pull it out, put it in here underneath our constructor and destructor. What we'll do then is remove the protected keyword on our AI spawner void, just so that we can access this method from outside of the scope of this class, or from once we've created a class instance. The protected keyword just means that only this class and classes that inherit from this class can access these methods. Okay, so having moved this over, what's going to happen is it'll remove our user script, but also it will break this method. And the reason it will break this method is because we now no longer have a reference to this AI spawner method. So far as this class is concerned, it doesn't exist. If we go ahead and try and validate our scripts, it should complain that it cannot find this variable AI spawner, or rather this method. So to fix that, we need to create ourselves a reference to that class. So what we will do is we will head back to our world quickly because we need to access the user script again. We'll add a user script back in. It'll give us a thing that says code here. And what we'll do is we'll add a private reference to our scr underscore rs underscore AI spawner class. And this is a member variable, so we'll call it m underscore rsai spawner. Okay. Now, what we're going to do is add ourselves a method called getAISpawner. It is a method of type scr underscore rs underscore AI spawner. So the reason we're adding this method here is so that we can access this private variable on the game mode in order to retrieve our instance of the AI spawner. So all we're going to do here is return m underscore rs AI spawner. Right. The last thing we need to do is ensure that this instance actually exists. So on game start, we're going to call super.gamestart, and then we're going to add a thing that moves up our scr underscore rs AI spawner. So what this does is when the game starts, it'll instance up a new rs AI spawner, and it'll assign it to that member variable. And then all we need to do is make sure that we're referencing that method properly. So we'll do the actual variable, so mRSAI spawner, or our class instance, .ai spawner. So this now references the actual method on that class. Right, so that should fix our initial AI spawn, the one we created to begin with. Okay, now on to triggers. What we're going to do is head back to our world editor, and we are going to place ourselves a new trigger So what we're going to do is we know that our AI are spawning in that forest and they're moving to this waypoint down here. If I just find ourselves that comment for the move point, we should see, yeah, there is our waypoint effectively. So we're going to create a faction control trigger. Okay, so to create ourselves a faction control trigger, what we need to do is find our create section. And inside this thing, we're going to look for a trigger. And in this particular case, we're interested in a faction control trigger entity. So we're just going to drag that across here and it'll generate it for us. And then what we're going to do is we're going to set the trigger shape to sphere. We're going to set the radius, so we'll make it about 30 meters. And we're just going to stick draw shape on so we can see what the radius looks like. We're then going to change the trigger activation type to first change and set periodic queries to true with an update period of 1 second. Okay, so that effectively will set up our trigger. You're going to want to untick this draw shape just so that the shape is not drawn inside the game as well. Okay, then what we'll do is rename this trigger, and we're going to call it trigger ambush USSR_1. That's just for easy tracking of the trigger so we can find it later if we need to. The next thing we need to do is add a scripted component to this trigger. So what we'll do is we will add an on activate section for this trigger, and then we can go ahead and open it up. So what we're going to do here is pretty much copy the code from our game mode, but we will have to make a few tweaks just so that it works. So the first thing we're going to do is just pull all of this stuff across. In fact, we'll include this as well. And then we'll just want to invoke super.onActivate just to ensure we don't break any default functionality that goes on here. We'll also need to pass the entity through to that. And then what we're going to do is make a couple of changes. The first one is how this thing loads its instance. So because we want to access our class in a specific way, and we don't want to new up a new AI spawner every time we need an AI spawner. So we can new up a new AI spawner every time we need an AI spawner, but that also limits us in our ability to manage what the AI spawner is doing. What we'll do is get our game mode _rs_testcloth.cost get game.get game mode .get AI spawner. Sorry. So we're passing that as the game mode, and then we can pull get AI spawner here. Get AI spawner. Okay, and that should give us the instance of the AI spawner. We do not need to create this or declare this as a member variable. This thing is just being accessed locally at this point, and we will reduce the spawn time from 10 seconds to 5 seconds. Right, so the next thing we'll need to do is change up our spawn group and our spawn position. The reason we want to do that is otherwise what will happen is it'll just spawn another US squad and have them move to the same point as that US squad. In this particular trigger case, I'm trying to create an ambush. So what we'll do is we'll go fetch ourselves the prefab for a USSR squad, and we'll create ourselves another spawn point as well. So if we head back to the world quickly and we go to the resource browser, we'll search for a USSR_group. We'll probably have to do group first. Group_USSR. And we'll get ourselves a rifle squad. And we'll copy the resource name over. Much the same as we did in the last tutorial, we're just going to go plop this in over here. We're not interested in changing the waypoint type at this time. And the other thing we're going to do is just copy our US AI spawn point 1 comments. We're gonna go into this tree line over here, perhaps over here, and we'll place it down. And we will call this US AI spawn point, okay, we're gonna change it to USSR AI spawn point underscore 1, just so we know what this thing is doing. Okay, the last thing we need to do is just grab this name over here, pull it across, and replace it over there. Right, so now our trigger is configured to set up an ambush once it is activated. Something I forgot to include here is this thing is being instanced without knowing what type it's trying to instance to. So we know it's trying to be of class XCR RS AI spawner, so we'll just ensure that it is of the right class type. Just before we kick everything off, I wanted to explain why we're doing it in this way. So, instancing a class in this manner is what is known as the singleton pattern in object-oriented programming. Now, as I mentioned before, there are a bunch of reasons you might want to utilize the singleton pattern as opposed to using any other kind of pattern. But some of the examples are tracking the global AI count, doing something akin to garbage management or recording performance metrics, and all of that can be done from a single instance of the class as opposed to multiple instances of the class. Now, there are other patterns you can use to manage this kind of thing, but at this point in time, this will be the easiest for this demonstration. And I'll go over a couple of more advanced topics in a later tutorial. Now, the last thing I want to add quickly that I forgot to include as part of the managers from the previous tutorial is a perception manager. So if we just go back to our resource browser and we take a look through Arma Reforger, we'll grab this perception manager and we can just go dump it with the rest of our stuff down here. Now, the reason we're doing this is because without a perception manager, the AI cannot see, or rather the AI cannot perceive, which will make for a pretty boring ambush. Effectively, we're just going to have the USSR squad run over and stand next to the US squad, which is not ideal. Right, the last thing to do is test that it works. It appears that it would not compile until I closed Workbench and opened it again. I didn't have this issue the other day, so I presume with the update that released today, maybe that introduced the issue. I'll see if I can find a workaround. If I do, I'll probably leave a comment for that, but otherwise, to avoid having that compiler error when you try and launch the game, it's probably best if you simply restart your Workbench. Okay, cool. So let's give this a test and see if it works. Right, okay, so our initial spawn is done. What we're going to do is just move them closer so that we don't have to wait for them to get to the trigger area. And what we should see now is the Russian squad spawning any second. So as it turns out, all did not go according to plan, and that's because I forgot two very important parts of the trigger. One is to set the owner faction key, and the other is to set the friendly ratio limit. So obviously, in this particular case, we're just going to set it to 1 so that only friendlies are present within this trigger in order to trigger the counterattack. But if you were to place this trigger over an enemy position, say it's defended by some Russian forces, you could set it to maybe 25% or 50% or something like that. So when it starts to look like either the U.S. forces are doing a dent or making a dent, or the U.S. forces are taking over, that they'll call for reinforcements in this particular case. Right, so that should fix our trigger. Let's give that another test, shall we? Right, so once again, the regular spawn has taken place as expected. We're just going to shift them closer to the trigger to ensure that we don't have to wait for the spawning to kick off, and hopefully we'll see, never mind, the Russian squad spawned successfully. So if our perception manager is working as we expect it to, we should see these guys engage the US forces. I hope I have covered everything in this tutorial with appropriate depth. If you'd like to follow along without having to type out the code while we're busy, in the description you will find a link to the Git repo with the source code for this tutorial. For this series of tutorials, I will be using the same Git repo for every tutorial. The only difference is that I will be using different branches for each tutorial. So in this particular case, the branch for this tutorial's code is called tutorial 2 trigger tutorial, and you will be able to find all the source code you're looking for there. As before, if you have any further questions, comments, or requests for more tutorials, let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and happy mission making.